Hi, and thanks for watching. When we talk about baptism, usually we talk about baptism from the perspective of the New Testament. Maybe we'll look at the baptism of John, or what Jesus says about baptism, or what Paul says about baptism. What I like to do, what I find fascinating, is not to start with the New Testament, but to start with the Old Testament when discussing baptism. Because you notice when people came out to John at the Jordan River to be baptized by him, no one was asking him, "Hey, John, what are you doing? What's this baptism that you're talking about?" No one asked that question, and that implies that they understood what John was doing. And I would argue they understood what John was doing because they had a centuries old understanding of how God had used water when he was dealing with his people. And what John was doing in baptizing in the Jordan River was not a novelty. This was nothing new. Instead, it just happened to be the newest way that God was using water to bless his people. Now, by looking at these Old Testament stories, we're going to have a deeper and a richer understanding of exactly what New Testament baptism is. It's going to fill in the picture for us of exactly what God does when he baptizes us into Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at the story of creation and the flood and the crossing of the Red Sea and the crossing of the Jordan, as well as various cleansings that took place at the Jordan River, and these ritual baths that are known as mikvot, which were used by first century Jews in order to be clean, to purify themselves before appearing before the face of God. And all of these together are going to give us a better understanding of what baptism is. So let's jump first of all to the creation account. That might not be the first place that people would ordinarily go to when talking about baptism, but it's very critical, and as we'll see, it was used by some of the earliest church fathers to talk about baptism. So in Genesis chapter 1, in these selected verses, here's what we read. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So my point here is that right from the beginning, right from creation, we see the Spirit of God connected with the water, bringing forth life from these waters by means of the Father's Word. Sound familiar? That's exactly what God continues to do in baptism. The Spirit of God is there at the water, and the Father speaks, and his word that he speaks is going to bring forth new life from these waters. So in Genesis 1, we have a picture of how God is using water and his Spirit and his word in creation. And we also then have a better idea of what God does in baptism, where he uses water and his Spirit and his word to bring forth a new creation, a recreation. This particular understanding of the connection between creation and baptism was already reflected, for instance, in these words of St. Ambrose, where he writes, "Why are you plunged into the water?" We read, "May the waters bring forth living creatures," and the living creatures were born. This happened at the beginning of creation. But for you it was reserved that water should bring you forth to grace, as that other water brought forth creatures to natural life. So just like water brought forth these natural creatures, so in baptismal water we are brought forth to grace. And this connection between baptism and the water is also reflected in the symbol of the fish, the ichthus in Greek, which we have evidence was used already in the 2nd century by Christians as a symbol, basically an acrostic that summed up exactly what their faith was. So if you take each of the letters that spell out the Greek word for fish, ichthus, each of these letters represents part of the Christian confession. So the first letter is for Jesus, the second for Christ, the third of God, the fourth Son, and the fifth Savior. So the ichthus, as a symbol and as an acrostic, stood for the confession Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Savior. And this particular use of a fish as a symbol for the Christians is also reflected in these words from the late 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century father named Tertullian. He says, "But we, little fishes, after the example of our ichthus, Jesus Christ, our fish, Jesus Christ, are born in water, nor have we any safety in any other way than by permanently abiding in water." So we are fishes. We find our life in the water because of our great ichthus, our great fish, Jesus Christ, who has made us that in holy baptism. So that's creation. Let's jump ahead to the next great water story, and that is the flood of Noah and his ark. So what was happening at the flood? Well, of course, God was both judging the world as well as rescuing Noah. You have two things going on. You have God bringing to death the unbelieving world and then ushering forth into a new life and into a new creation, Noah and his family. So this dual action by God, both of destruction by water as well as salvation in water, is picked up by the Apostle Peter as he writes in his first epistle, chapter 3, these words. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, that is in Greek, it's the antitype of this. So baptism, which is the antitype of this, that is the flood, now saves you. Not as the removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. So Peter is saying a lot of things, and I know this passage is a little bit ambiguous in some spots. It's hard to understand, but don't miss the main point that he's making. Peter is drawing a connection between what God did at the flood and what God does in baptism. Just like God saved Noah and his family through the waters, as well as bring judgment on the unbelieving world, so in baptism, God saves us. He brings us safely through these waters in order that we might be part of the new creation that comes through the work of the Messiah. Now, there's a rich, long history of the use of the flood when talking about baptism. We'll just look at one example. This is from the 2nd century apologist whose name was Justin. He studied various philosophy, and then finally he came into the Christian faith, and he became an advocate, an apologist for the Christian faith. And then later he was martyred, and so his name in the church is called Justin Martyr, 2nd century teacher. And in one of his works, which has come down to us, it's called The Dialogue with Truffaut, he talks about the connection between baptism and the flood. Truffaut was a Jew, and Justin was dialoguing with him about the Christian faith. And so Justin says this to Truffaut. You know then, sir, I said, that God has said in Isaiah to Jerusalem, I saved thee in the deluge of Noah. By this, which God said, was meant that the mystery of saved men appeared in the deluge, appeared in the flood. For righteous Noah, along with the other mortals at the deluge, that is, with his wife, his own wife, his 3 sons and their wives, being 8 in number, were symbol of the 8th day, wherein Christ appeared when he rose from the dead, forever the first in power. For Christ, being the firstborn of every creature, became again the chief of another race, regenerated by himself through water and faith and wood, containing the mystery of the cross, even as Noah was saved by wood when he rode over the waters with his household. Now, Justin, as is typical for him, is packing a lot into this, a lot of Old Testament symbolism, the connection between the wood of the ark and the wood of the cross, and Noah and Christ, and the salvation at the flood and the salvation in the Messiah. But his main point, of course, the main point that I want to pull out of this especially, is that early on in the 2nd century, this apologist, Justin Martyr, is making this connection between the flood and baptism. For those of you who are interested, you can also look at Martin Luther's famous flood prayer, which was used in baptismal liturgies from the time of the Reformation. It's also been adapted for use in Anglican churches in their baptismal ceremonies as well. In Luther's flood prayer, he too draws a connection between the work that God did for Noah and the work that God does in baptism. And in all these, the message is the same, that there's a twofold work that God does in his use of water in stories like the flood and baptism. He kills and he makes alive. He destroys and he recreates. So when we're baptized, our old sinful nature is drowned, it's killed, But then emerging from that is the new life that God gives us. And to use the language of Justin Martyr, we become part of this new race. The early church talked about three races: the Jews, the Gentiles, and the Christians. So we become a part of this new humanity in baptism that Christ gives to us in the gift of baptism. Now, interestingly, the use of the flood and the ark and Noah has helped us to talk also about the architecture of the church. It's part of how the church itself was structured, built. So, for instance, in this particular picture here, you see what's called the nave of the church. The nave begins at the back of the church and it works its way toward the altar. And so it's a central part of the church. And nave is from the Latin word for ship. And of course, you hear it reflected in our word for navy as well. So the nave is the church as a ship floating through the waters of this world, making its way to the shore of the New Jerusalem. Also, interestingly, not very well known, but the word pulpit not only means a raised platform by which someone addresses an audience, but the word for pulpit is also the word for the front of a ship. So in the bow of the ship and the front of the ship by which you look where you're going, that is called the pulpit. And we have a usage of this, a reflection of this, famously in these words from Moby Dick, in which he's talking about a particular strange pulpit at the beginning of his novel. He writes this: "What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part. All the rest comes in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From thence it is the storm of God's quick wrath is first descried, and the bow must bear the earliest brunt. From thence it is the God of breezes fair and foul is first invoked for favorable winds. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow." Beautiful words to talk about the connection between the pulpit of a ship and the pulpit in our churches. So let's move on. We have creation, we have the flood. The next major water story is the crossing of the Red Sea. The crossing of the Red Sea is basically the story of the flood, but retold. So you have a connection between the flood story, in which you have both destruction and salvation, and the crossing of the Red Sea, in which you have these same two things: destruction of Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, as well as salvation for Israel. And this particular image of the Red Sea as the place where God is saving his people in this Exodus, this is picked up by later prophets. The prophets often preached upon earlier scriptures, and they were talking about the Bible too. They talked about the Exodus, for instance. Isaiah in particular draws heavily upon the Exodus when he's describing the Messianic kingdom. And what's fascinating is how Isaiah is using the language of the Exodus and what God did at those waters to talk about what God is going to do in the Messianic kingdom. We'll just look at one passage in particular. This is from Isaiah chapter 11. "And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and will wave his hand over the river Euphrates with his scorching breath, and strike it into 7 channels, and he will lead people across in sandals. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that remains of his people, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt." Now, what Isaiah is saying is that God is going to do a new Exodus, and this is going to be the work of the Messiah, which he's been talking about all in chapter 11. And this work of the Messiah is going to be an even greater Exodus, because in the original Exodus, God just brought Israel out of Egypt. But in this new Exodus, they're going to come not just from Egypt, but from across the river Euphrates. So it's going to be a worldwide Exodus in which God is bringing his people back home. This became the way in which the Israelites understood what God was going to do in his Messiah. So the Messiah's work is connected with the water. The image of the Red Sea becomes the image by which the work of the anointed one of God is described. This then is picked up by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, where he uses Christian language to describe what God did at the Red Sea. So here are his words to the Corinthian church in chapter 10. "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual drink, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. A lot of fascinating stuff in this particular passage, but what I want you to focus in on is how Paul is describing the Red Sea as a baptism. He said they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And of course, what he wants us to do is to make the connection between that Red Sea baptism and our baptism. The Israelites were baptized into Moses at the Red Sea. We are baptized into Christ in the Red Sea of baptism. So when you read these stories in the Old Testament, you're getting the pedigree, you're getting the background of what God does for us in baptism. Now, to jump ahead, we have creation, we have the flood, we have the crossing of the Red Sea, and now we have a second crossing. We had the Red Sea, and now we have the Jordan crossing. And the Jordan crossing is understood to be kind of the bookend for the Red Sea crossing. So they crossed the Red Sea when they left Egypt, and they're going to cross the Jordan River when they finally reach the Promised Land. So these two water crossings are the bookends of the Exodus story. The Jordan River is just there's so much that's connected with the Jordan River. And as I often say in my videos and in my lectures, when you think about geography in the Old Testament, you have to remember that geography is inherently theological. God has embedded his theology in the stuff of creation. And the Jordan River is a classic example of that because so many things happen at the Jordan River. The Jordan River is what I like to think of as this liminal space where you're leaving something and you're entering into something new. It's like a threshold. You're leaving what is behind and you're crossing this liminal period and you're entering into something which is new. And there's numerous Old Testament stories which exemplify this. So, for instance, we have at the Jordan River, of course, Israel is leaving behind. They're leaving behind the wilderness, the old wilderness, and they're entering into the new land of promise. So that's the first particular connection here between the old and the new. The second is that they're leaving behind the old Moses, their old leader, and they've acquired a new leader whose name is Joshua. So old wilderness, old leader left behind, new land, new leader now is with them. And then thirdly, we have another story between Elijah and Elisha that exemplifies this as well. So Elijah is about to leave. He's about to be taken up into heaven. So he comes with Elisha, who is going to be his successor. And they go to the Jordan River. They strike the Jordan River. It parts, just like back in Joshua's day. They walk across on dry ground into the wilderness. Notice they're going into the wilderness, the Transjordan, where Israel had been. Elijah is taken up by the fiery chariot into heaven. And then Elisha comes back to the Jordan River, strikes it again with a cloak. The waters part. He goes across and enters into the land of promise. Now, what's happening here symbolically is that we have a repetition of what happened with Moses and Israel and Joshua and Israel when they entered the promised land. So Elijah is gone, just like Moses was gone. They left the wilderness behind, just like Israel left the wilderness behind. And now Elisha is like a new Joshua, entering into the promised land to conquer it by means of his preaching, his prophesying. And there's one more story that's significant here for us to understand the Jordan River, and that is that God desired even the Gentiles to be included in his good gifts of cleansing and healing. And we see this in the case of Naaman the Syrian, who had leprosy or some kind of skin disease. He goes to the Jordan River, and the prophet Elisha tells him to bathe in the Jordan River. He does. And when he does, it says his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. Again, this is nothing more than a repetition of the same pattern that we've seen before. He leaves the old behind, his disease and his paganism and his non-Israelite ways, and he enters into the new. He has new flesh. His body is restored, and he's now a believer in the God of Israel. He leaves the old behind, and God brings him into the new. Now, all of this is important because it helps us to understand exactly what God was doing when he made sure that John baptized in the Jordan River. So when John goes to the Jordan River to baptize, he didn't just happen to choose the Jordan River. He chose that on purpose. There's like no other place that John could be baptizing besides the Jordan River, because that was the place that God had prepared for his people to be ready for the Messiah. John goes out as Jesus' forerunner, and so he goes to the Jordan. He goes to this liminal space, this boundary between the old and the new, and he brings Israel out there in order that they might have a renewal of what God did for their forefathers. So they go out to the wilderness And they, in being baptized, are like crossing the Jordan River again. Jesus himself goes out to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. Why? Because Elijah, John the Baptist, had to decrease in order that this new Elisha, Jesus, might increase. So it's a time in which one prophet disappears and another prophet appears, the prophet of prophets, Christ our Lord. And so this is a time in which we do away with the old covenant and the new covenant is coming. We do away with the old prophet and we have a new prophet coming. This is the place where God speaks to his son. You are my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. He speaks from heaven, just like he spoke at Mount Sinai in the giving of the old covenant. Now he speaks to this one who is going to be the bearer of the new covenant. And just like God's Spirit hovered over the face of the waters in the new creation, so God's Spirit comes down in the form of a dove and alights upon Christ in these waters, because Christ is the one who brings about a new creation. All of that is packed into this space, this river where John baptized. So all these Jordan River stories help us to understand the background of exactly why John baptized there. Now, to move to our last section, we're going to talk just a minute about the various kinds of cleansing rituals which help us to round out our understanding of baptism. Very quickly, the first one is what's called the Bronze Sea. So in this slide, you see a picture of the temple as well as the one artist's depiction of what the Bronze Sea would look like. It's a massive water vessel that was kept at the temple, and the priests were to cleanse their hands and their feet in the water of the Bronze Sea before they entered for service in the Lord's holy house. So the priest, prior to worship, would cleanse himself, would wash their hands and feet in the Bronze Sea, and then, and only then, would they enter into the Lord's presence. This imagery is picked up by the author of Hebrews in chapter 11 to describe what God does for us. So he says, "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." So, just like the Old Testament priest had their hands and feet washed before they entered into the holy place, so God washes our bodies with holy baptism so that we might be ready to enter into the presence of God. The author of Hebrews, again, is drawing upon this Old Testament imagery in order to describe the washing we have from Christ. There's one more cleansing story from the Old Testament, and this is kind of a strange one. It's about the ashes of the red heifer. So in the book of Numbers, it says that the priests are to take a red heifer outside the camp, slaughter it, and to burn its whole body to ashes, and to mix various materials with these ashes, and to put them all in water, so that when a person became ritually unclean by contact with a corpse, these ashen waters could be sprinkled upon them, and they would be cleansed. Now, this particular account is used again by the author of Hebrews to describe what God does for us. So in Hebrews chapter 9 it says, "For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, if that sanctifies for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" So there's a connection drawn here between these ashen waters of the red heifer cleansing externally and the blood of Christ cleansing our conscience to serve the living God. Now, this helps us to better understand exactly what baptism is, because it's in baptism that the blood of Christ is applied to us, in which we are connected to this cleansing that God has accomplished for us. Now, one more example. And this is not in the Bible. This is part of the first century practice of the Jews. When they had become ritually unclean, perhaps it was a woman after a menstrual cycle, or a man after sexual intercourse, or even a Gentile who was a proselyte into Judaism, there was a ceremony they would go through, and this was called a ritual bath. In Hebrew, it's known as a mikveh. A mikveh was a bath or a pool in which water would be collected, and the person would go down into this, and they would cleanse themselves before they would enter into the presence of God. And we have examples, archaeologists found examples of these all over the land of Israel, including at Jerusalem in front of the temple. They found these in private homes in Jerusalem, in the basements of first century private homes. And they've also found, as this slide here illustrates, they found these at Qumran, close to where, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, probably an Essene community living there at Qumran. So in all these various places, the mikvot were used for ritual cleansing. John and the people, his contemporaries, they were very familiar with this. Many of them probably engaged in these sorts of ritual cleansings. So all of this provides us with the background of exactly what baptism is and why no one was surprised when John was baptizing or when Jesus was baptizing, or why the church continued to baptize and continued to baptize to this day. All of this is the Old Testament pedigree for baptism. So beginning with creation and the flood and the crossing of the Red Sea, the crossing of the Jordan, all of the various cleansings that take place, all the way to these mikvot in the first century, all of this is giving us the background for what baptism is and how God uses it to cleanse us, to bring us into the new covenant, to purify us, to both kill us and make us alive, to join us to the death and resurrection of Christ, to apply the sanctifying blood of Christ to us, to wash our bodies so that we might enter into the Lord's presence, to do away with the old and to bring in the new. All of this is the Old Testament pedigree of baptism. And I hope this quick run through has been helpful to you so that you can better understand what God has done for you. You are the one who has received this gift of baptism. And it has a long and a beautiful and a rich history that begins with Genesis 1 and continues to this very day. I hope this has been helpful to you. If it has, feel free to share it. If you're a teacher or a pastor and you'd like to use this to help others learn more about the Old Testament pedigree of baptism, then of course, by all means, do that. So thank you for watching, and I pray that God would continue to bless your study of His Word and continue to bless you as you live in the life and the freedom that He's given to you in your baptism.